We're now taking a look at the situation in Ukraine and Russia, and we're very pleased to have Chris Nineham with us. Hi, Chris. Thanks for joining us. So, a few days ago, well, a week ago roughly, it looked like it might be over almost, and Zelensky said, "Okay, we will never join. Ukraine will never join NATO." And that was one of the sticking points, wasn't it? What happened? Why is it still going on, and more ferociously so?
Well, the Zelensky moment was obviously very important, and I mean, it was quite extraordinary that it wasn't commented on more, really, because his admission, which was then echoed the following day by Boris Johnson, that Ukraine would never join NATO, um, is an admission, obviously, that the issue of Ukrainian accession to NATO was regarded by the West, by Western powers, by Ukrainians as clearly being an issue for the Russians. I mean, they wouldn't have made this statement otherwise. Um, and it's precisely that point that has been used as a criticism of the anti-war movement and those who are critical of the Western response to the invasion. Um, so, we need to really shout this still from the rooftops because it's not being recognised in the mainstream. That all those who have said and are saying that NATO is part of the problem here have actually been vindicated in part by what Zelensky said and by the fact that Johnson and, obviously other Western powers are supported this move. So, that was significant. I mean, what the situation is more broadly is difficult to tell, really, in terms of the peace negotiations. It's true what you're saying, Tina, that since over the last 48 hours, they appear to have run into the sand. There's now much more of an emphasis on the war of attrition, the continuing war. That's absolutely disastrous. But, I think the underlying situation is one that at least potentially can lead towards in the direction of more diplomacy and more negotiation, because it seems to me that neither side is really getting what they want out of it. That, on the one hand, the Russian troops are largely bogged down, that, the initial plan of a blitzkrieg that would topple the regime, which does appear to be quite surprisingly in a way, but it does appear to be what the Russians were pursuing. That's obviously history now. So the Russians are making slow advances, but the cost will be very high in terms of Ukrainian lives, but also politically for Putin, because clearly the populations of Ukraine and Russia are very, very connected. And to carry on like this, to kill more people, to pursue more of a kind of war of bombardment, a war of that will inevitably lead to more civilian casualties, is very politically problematic for Putin. On the other side, the Ukrainians have resisted, the Ukrainian army has stood up, but on the other hand, they too, if they pursue this, they must know that basically what they're committing to is a very, very long, drawn-out war of attrition, and that is not good for them either. So I think there is space and the potential for continuing negotiations. I mean, that's not inevitable. These people are not particularly rational. They are pursuing their own interests. Nevertheless, I think this is the point, this is the angle that the movement in this country and beyond needs to pursue quite relentlessly now. I think we need to be arguing hard that the peace process is the only way forward, that a diplomatic solution is essential. That's the only way we can avoid continuing catastrophe for the Ukrainian people. And we need to push that argument. And obviously, one aspect of that has to be the demand that Ukraine, in any sensible peace negotiations, needs to put forward, not just that it won't be in NATO, but that it will be actually an independent, neutral country, and that's essential. So I think it's a horrible situation. It could potentially be um, uh, a kind of unfolding tragedy for weeks to come. But at least there's that opening now politically for us. And I think that the movement as a whole needs to really go for it now and say peace process now, ceasefire, withdrawal of Russian troops, and the commitment and the guarantee of Ukrainian neutrality. And that sounds like, I think if we do that, we'll be chiming with, huge numbers of people in this country.
I mean, the sticking point seems to be the situation of the two republics, the Donbas region and Crimea is also being opened up again. That shouldn't belong to Russia, etc. But it's I mean, what's the solution there? I mean, it seems to be clear, despite the fraudulent referendums that have taken place in both of those regions, that a clear majority actually wants autonomy from Ukraine. How can we fight for that in a coherent way, in your view?
Well, I mean, I think you're right. I think really the Minsk II Accords recognized autonomy, as you say, various forms. Obviously, there's different kind of constitutional versions of that. But yeah, I think there is probably an overwhelming sentiment in most of the Donbass for that to be enacted. And, we have to argue that has to be part of any serious peace negotiations. It was part of negotiations back in 2014. Why on earth couldn't it be part of peace negotiations now? That has to be absolutely clear as part of our argument. I mean, on the other hand, it's not really our place to get into specific kind of positions about what should happen internally in Ukraine. I think we have to recognize that Ukrainian independence and neutrality is a complex question. But I think we should stop at saying, and the question of the Donbass needs to be taken seriously. It needs to be part of the discussion. I don't think we should go much further than that. I think the crucial thing is we need to be putting maximum pressure on our government, because still what's happening is that the Western powers in general, and particularly the US and the UK, are pushing for a kind of, a kind of radical, hawkish policy on this. I mean, I heard Wesley Clark on the radio the other day, former commander-in-chief of the US military, and he was calling for essentially no-fly, or a version of no-fly zones. He was talking about sending in the blue helmets, as he put it, UN soldiers into Ukraine. There's still quite a strong, very, very confrontational, very, very combative line being put from parts of the US establishment. And it's largely echoed in Britain. And I think we've got to campaign hard against that. And the way to undercut that is to say now, look, the opportunity is there for negotiations, for a diplomatic settlement, and that this kind of talk can only have the effect of lessening the chances of those negotiations going ahead successfully. And I think that has to be the cutting edge of our argument.
Last question then, kind of two related issues, is the question of sanctions. I know you're not in favor of sanctions, but what kind of impact are they having on the oligarchs and, more importantly, the working class in Russia? Have you seen anything that they are actually, really harming people on the ground yet? And the people we want to succeed, we want the anti-war movement, the people in Russia to succeed and be strong, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sanctions are very radical. I mean, they're much more radical than I think most people expected. And they do involve, obviously the cancellation of the pipeline that was being organized with Germany. They involve the pulling out of the SWIFT payment system. These things are impacting. And I was talking to a student in a university locally to me, a Russian student, who was saying that one of the things that's happening is that across Britain, Russian students, and actually Ukrainian students in a slightly different way, but Russian students are unable to pay their fees because the banks have collapsed in Russia, and because of the SWIFT payment system being taken down. And in QMU, which is the university she's at, management are saying, okay, you've got to leave the university because you're not paying. And by the way, that means you're going to lose your visa. But so that gives you a little insight into
Oops.
the extent to which these sanctions are. Consider that what Putin is trying to play in Russia to a feeling of anger and resentment at the humiliation that has been meted out to the Russian people and the Russian nation over the years by the Western powers. This isn't clever. This isn't sensible, because what this will do, potentially, it has the possibility of increasing the sort of national sentiment, the kind of national unity, and actually making life more difficult for those people who are still bravely campaigning against the war in Russia. So yeah, I think the sanctions I think they are biting. I think they're causing serious problems. And in the end of the day, the oligarchs they'll be able to bypass them. They'll be all right. It's ordinary people in Russia who will be suffering. That's bad in itself, but it's also politically illiterate. It's also not good when it comes to trying to actually end the war and create a movement, or at least encourage a movement in Russia against Putin himself.
What are you hearing from the anti-war movement? I mean, 14 years in prison if you speak out against the war. This is a pretty harsh punishment being meted out. Are you in touch with anti-war activists? Can they speak out?
Yeah, we've got a teach-in on Saturday, which in London, where we're going to have Russian and Ukrainian peace activists who are they're zooming in, obviously, but yeah, they're speaking out. I mean, I think it clearly is hard, particularly in Ukraine, to be honest. I think it's very, very hard to be an anti-war activist in Ukraine at the moment. There are some. In Russia, it's tough as well. I think the campaign is continuing, though. I think about 4 or 5 days ago, there was a petition released that had been signed by 10,000 students and staff at Moscow University calling for an end to the war. We saw, obviously, the very brave stand taken by the Channel 2 producer, and she's still at large anyway in Russia for the time being, facing charges. But so far, she's still at home, and there are still protests going on, not the same size as they were 2 or 3 weeks ago, but nevertheless significant protests taking place. So far, Putin hasn't been able to silence the anti-war movement. I think it runs deep. I don't sort of hold the view or support the view that some people are saying that the Russian ruling class is unified in some way against Putin. I think Putin has, at least around him, a very loyal layer of apparatchiks and senior management of various different parts of the economy who are very loyal to him. I don't think he couldn't be conducting the war at all if that wasn't the case. But I think there is popular discontent, and it's still being mobilized.
Thank you very much for joining us, Chris. I think as socialists, we say, we don't side with either side. We side with the working class, and I think you brought that out well. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much, Tina. Thanks to everyone.